Hello, and welcome to the third session of Module 2 of this training for strengthening planning capacities of MOA officials in OECS countries. This session will be dedicated to the analysis of costs and financing in an education system. So, if we want to unpack public funding to education, there are different ways of doing so. Okay, the first one that we've already mentioned is to look at the education expenditure by level. A small question for you. Let's take a moment and think about which level of education do you think your government is spending the most on? Do you think your government is spending more on primary education, on junior secondary, on senior secondary, higher education? If we look at this example of OECS countries and their education expenditure by level, we'll see that the distribution by level differs not noticeably between countries. This data is extracted from the UIS database, the UNESCO Institute of Statistics database, which compiles, among other indicators, data on education expenditure. We can see here that the green bars, the green sections at the bottom of the bars, is the education expenditure for pre-primary. The yellow sections is primary. The greenish section is secondary. And the grayer section, which appear for countries C, D, E, and F, is for post-secondary non-tertiary education, which are typically vocational trainings, vocational programs. The darker green towards the top of the bars is for tertiary, higher education. So country A, for instance, spends approximately 90% of its budget on primary and secondary, and almost as much on primary and secondary. Here we have lumped together junior secondary and senior secondary, because for some of these countries the desegregation was not available. We'll talk about this in a moment. If we look at country D, we'll see that country D spends more of its budget on pre-primary and tertiary than country A. And secondary as a whole takes the largest share of the education budget. What you may see is that we also have brown sections at the top of some of the bars for countries B, C, E, and F. These are expenditures that are not directly associated with a specific education level. So what can we do if we are faced with expenditure that is not clearly associated with a specific education level? For a large part of education expenditures, we know that those teachers, those education, those learning resources are for a specific education level. But for instance, for central administration, it's difficult to say that it's more for primary or for secondary or for higher education. So what we do is that we make estimates and we notionally associate those expenditures to the various education levels. So we separate this section of non-specified expenditures, and we affect to them the same share that we witness in the expenditures that we have been able to identify. So we replicate this share. Okay, if, for instance, we had 5% of pre-primary expenditure out of the total that is identified, then we applied 5% to that non-specified expenditure, and we will attribute it to pre-primary. And this way, we reconstruct and we reassociate these different sections to the total already identified. And we reconstruct this total expenditure by allocating the non-specified expenditures to the different education levels. This is what we had before, the previous slide, where we still had non-specified expenditure. And with this exercise, we can reallocate those non-specified expenditures to different education levels. And this makes the comparison easier between the different countries. So one obvious thing that we can see is that some countries do have expenditures on tertiary education, while some don't. And this, of course, will change the structure of the expenditure. And you can see that, for instance, countries A, E, and F seem to have similar structures in their education expenditure by level. It may also happen that some expenditure is not easily specified between two levels. So you may have some expenditures that you cannot split between, for instance, pre-primary and primary, or between junior and senior secondary. This is probably the case for some of the countries that I mentioned before, and why I showed only the expenditures for secondary, because the split between junior and senior secondary was not available. In that case, some estimations can be made based on the proportion of the number of teachers or the number of students. For instance, if we have a core of teachers for secondary with no clear database, no clear information on which teachers are teaching in junior secondary or in senior secondary, we may use the number of students to estimate the number of teachers teaching in one level or the other. The implicit hypothesis behind this is that the student-teacher ratio will be the same. If we have more information on the size of the classes, for instance, this will help us allocate the teachers and the salaries for these teachers to junior secondary and senior secondary. Okay? In some other cases, the number of teachers can be used. Number of teachers is sometimes used to make this estimation because they drive a large part of the budget. So they are generally a good indication of what is spent. They're also a sort of proxy of the number of classes to which some expenses are associated. Technically, this estimation can be done for more than 2 education levels, but typically pre-primary and primary are structurally quite similar, in the same way that junior and senior secondary are similar, and in which there may be expenditures that are more difficult to dissociate between them, while primary and secondary, for instance, are quite different in terms of location, in terms of management of teachers, etc. And expenses are usually quite easily identifiable between these two levels, between primary and secondary. Another way of looking in details into the public funding for education is to look at this education expenditure by type and nature. If we think about the type of expenditure, we generally make a distinction between capital expenditure and recurrent expenditure. The capital expenditure is the expenditure for education goods and assets that are used for more than 1 year. Typically includes construction, infrastructure, major renovation or repairs of buildings, and the purchase of heavy equipment or vehicles. Current expenditure or recurrent expenditure is consumed within a year and needs to be renewed every year. It typically always includes staff compensation, current expenditure other than staff, and other expenditure such as teaching materials, administration, etc. These are definition from the UIS. One important point to mention is that the teaching materials, for instance, may in some cases be considered capital expenditures. School manuals, for instance, would have a lifespan longer than 1 year, and they may be considered capital expenditure. In some other cases, they are considered current expenditure. You may hear me during this presentation use current or recurrent expenditure interchangeably. Both terms are used. UIS talks of current expenditures. You will see in many resources that recurrent expenditures is used more frequently. So why is it important to look at public expenditure by type? First, because it is always interesting to understand the structure of the expenditure, but also because knowing the proportion of current and capital expenditure will help identify where there is space for investment, for capital expenditure. So recurrent expenditure must be controlled to leave some space for investment. Investment also, when being considered, we need to think of the impact of that investment on recurrent expenditure. For instance, if some funding is available for construction of some facilities, we must always remember that they will generate some recurrent expenditure for maintenance, for instance. And in that perspective, it's important to have a sense of the share of a total expenditure that is spent on recurrent expenditure and on capital expenditure. So a small question for you. What proportion of your ministry's expenditure do you think is spent on recurrent expenditures? The answer from some data from the UIS database indicates that approximately 90% of the education expenditure in some OECS countries is spent on recurrent expenditure. This is based on some examples of countries in the UIS database. It may differ from some country to the next, but it's quite typical for it to be in that order. When we look at the public expenditure by nature, we go a little bit further. If we consider the total public expenditure that goes for education, we've talked already about the type of expenditure, the current or recurrent expenditure, as opposed to the capital expenditure. And this current expenditure can be of different nature. It can be compensation. Compensation typically includes salaries, but it's also incentives to teach in difficult areas or difficult schools, for instance. It also includes contribution to social security, etc. So it's more than just the salary, the average salary that a teacher may have on its paycheck. So there's compensation, there's goods and services, and transfers. These are three typical categories of current expenditures that you will find in a national budget. Transfers will be transfers from one ministry to another, for instance, so between education and social protection, for instance. You may have some funds for early childhood development which are channeled to another ministry which provides some services, help provide some services, etc. Compensation. When we look at this, it's important to look at the compensation of teaching staff, so teachers in the classrooms, those who teach, and non-teaching staff, which may be ancillary staff at the school level, as well as maintenance staff and central administration staff, for instance. For goods and services, we may see some learning and teaching materials, some maintenance costs, and some utilities and a lot of other goods and services. So another question for you: what proportion of your ministry's recurrent expenditure do you think is spent on compensations as a total and on teaching staff compensation? Again, an indication from OECS suggests that it may be between 50 to 60% on compensation and 40 to 55% on teaching staff compensation in particular. So if we look at this chart from the previous slide, it's a conceptual chart to describe the different kinds, the public expenditure by nature. It's not representative of the scale, the importance of those different expenditure in reality. If we want a more representative scale, we would look at something like this. Current expenditure representing the vast majority of the total expenditure for education, compensation representing more than half of the total current expenditure, and teaching staff representing a very large part of the compensation. Again, this is illustrative. It may differ from a country to the next, but from the preliminary information or data that is available in OECS, this is a general picture that we can paint of public expenditure on education by nature. If we zoom in a bit more and concentrate on the compensation for teachers, it's important to realize that there are some implicit trade-offs. In particular, in a situation with a fixed budget for teaching staff compensation, some implicit trade-offs appear between the number of learners that can be taught, the conditions of learning, and in particular the number of learners per teacher, the number of teachers, and the compensation and work conditions of teachers. For instance, the weekly hours that teachers need to have to work. For instance, if we want to increase the educational offer, if we want to increase the number of students that can be taught, we will need more teachers. If we hire more teachers with a fixed compensation budget, teaching staff compensation budget, it means that we will need to decrease the salary. Okay? Another way of increasing the number of students without increasing the number of teachers would be to increase the number of learners per teachers. Another situation is a situation where we might want to improve the conditions of learning, so decrease the number of learners per teacher. In that case, we'll need more teachers, which means that again, within a fixed budget, we will have to decrease the compensation. Now that we've decomposed the public funding for education by education level, by type, and by nature, we can take a step back and look at unit costs. Unit costs are a way of comparing the total spending on education to the number of learners, students served. We talk of public unit costs, and the definition of the public unit cost is the government funding per student. So it's the total expenditure on education divided by the number of students. In practice, we analyze this indicator by education level, considering the public unit cost for the whole education system, all education levels together, does not make much sense and does not provide much information. But we decompose this by education level, and this allows us to make comparisons, to compare those different education levels in particular and see which education levels are the most costly per student. And it can also be used for comparisons between countries. And this can be used to look at efficiency. For instance, we might compare the spending on secondary education per child and look at the results in terms of learning from one country to the next, and see whether a country with similar spending or with more funding actually has more results in terms of learning. It can also be used for benchmarking by making comparisons to similar countries. So another question for you: which education level do you think has the highest public unit costs in your country? Do you think your government spends more per child on pre-primary, primary, junior secondary, senior secondary, or higher education? These are other examples from OECS countries. You can see that the variation is very wide from one country to the next and between education levels. In this first representation, we're looking at the public unit costs in nominal terms, which means in terms of currency units. Here it's expressed in US dollars for comparison. You see that in country A, for instance, the unit cost varies from approximately 200 American dollars per year and per child in pre-primary to 2,200 approximately dollars for senior secondary. Okay? You can see that in country C, however, pre-primary is much more costly than country A. It costs approximately $2,400 per year to educate one child in pre-primary, which is the equivalent of the cost of secondary education, while primary education in country C still is costs around 1,000 American dollars per year. Okay? So you can see a lot of variations. However, looking at public unit costs is interesting for a country from a country perspective in nominal terms, but when we make comparisons, when we want to compare the situation of our education system to other countries, it is generally preferred to express it in terms of percentage of the GDP per capita. The GDP per capita represents the average wealth in the country per inhabitant. So it's a better representation of the wealth of the country. It's a better representation of costs as well of goods and services. So if we look at this chart now, where the public unit cost is expressed as percentage of GDP per capita, we can see that country A and country D, in fact, have relatively similar level of expenditure for secondary and for primary, as well as for pre-primary, in fact. So the comparison is easier to do. You can see that country E, for instance, spends the most on junior secondary education, considering the size of its economy, considering its level of economic development. You can see that pre-primary, for instance, varies largely, not as much as was visible when we were looking at nominal terms between country A and country C, but country C still spends much more on pre-primary per child than country A. Another interesting perspective is to look at public unit costs as multiples of the unit costs in primary. This facilitates the comparison of unit costs between the education levels, but also to compare the differences in unit costs between different countries. So for instance, we can see more easily here that in country A, pre-primary is much less costly. The unit cost for pre-primary is much lower than primary, while in country C it is much higher. In country D it is similarly to country A, much lower than for primary. If we look at secondary, for instance, secondary is more costly than primary in all the countries for which we have examples here, although in country C it is much more costly, while in countries A and E the costs are relatively similar. So secondary is only marginally greater, more costly than primary. So let's take a minute to think about the sources, to talk about the sources of data for public funding for education. The primary source for this analysis is the national budget. When doing this analysis, you will not only look at voted budgets, but preferably executed budgets. There is sometimes considerable or substantial difference between what was voted by the parliament and what was in fact executed, disbursed. There are different reasons for this. Some delays, there may be some need for reprioritization of some funds during the year, etc. So two things to say about this. The first is that we here have an additional indicator, which is the execution rate of budget. The execution rate of a budget is the executed budget divided by the voted budget. this execution rate can be examined at the education for the whole education sector, or it can be examined by type for comparing a recurrent expenditure to capital expenditure execution. Quite typically, the execution rate of recurrent expenditures is higher than capital expenditures because it's composed of salaries and other expenditures that are recurring. So we know what we'll need to be paid, and the systems are in place. While capital expenditures, which may involve construction or purchase, international purchase, may know some delays, which will impact the execution rate. The second thing to say about this is that because we prefer looking at executed budgets, there will be a time lag between the analysis and the data that we look at. The analysis will also look at voted budgets, but these numbers will be preliminary, and the indicators, firm indicators, will be calculated on executed budget, so at least 1 year after they are voted. A second source of data for public funding for education, specifically for the calculation of unit cost, will be the EMIS, the Education Management Information System, which contains data on enrollments, which is used to calculate unit costs. We can also mention that public expenditure reviews and public expenditure tracking surveys are types of studies or analysis that go further into the analysis of public funding, in particular for what we're interested in, public funding for education. And they can provide, for instance, more details on questions such as at which level the education expenditures are made, whether it's at central level, at decentralized level, or at school level. It may also give information about which areas, which parishes, for instance, in fact receive more of the education funding, etc. We'll conclude by saying a few words about household spending on education. Analyzing household spending of education requires a whole different set of data. National budgets and EMIS, Education Management Information Systems, typically include no information on spending made by families for education. So we generally resort to household surveys. There may be specifically designed household surveys for to analyze the spending of families, of households, on different sectors. So how much families spend on food, on housing, on education, on their health, on transportation, etc. There may also be some information in some more generic household surveys. But typically those household surveys that can be exploited for this analysis will ask families how much they spend on school fees, how much they spend on uniform, for instance, how much they spend on school materials, how much they spend on transportation, school meals, etc. And this allows for the calculation of a total budget for education. And when comparing this budget for education for the whole household to the number of children that they have at different levels, we can estimate the average unit cost of education for families for each education level. Again, this is mostly interesting by education level, the same way we calculated unit costs, public unit costs by education level. The family spending per child is most interesting to be analyzed by education level, and it can be compared to that of the government. For a specific education level, how much does the government spend per child compared to how much families spend for a child, for that same child, for this education level. So this analysis of household spending on education allows us to ask and to answer some questions related to affordability and equity. For instance, can everyone afford a particular type of education? When I say type, I mean level of education, but it can also be a form of teaching. It can be, we can oppose general secondary, for instance, to vocational secondary. Or we can oppose one form of teaching, one location to another, etc. So by calculating the cost for a family, we can get a sense of how affordable it is for a family of different levels of wealth to use these education services. Another question that we may ask is whether the high costs for families are in fact the result of a lack of public funding. And we may compare, as I said before, the spending per child from the families, from households, to the funding per child from the government, and compare this level by level. If we look at the total funding, household plus government, for the education of a child in primary, secondary, higher education, does the government contribute to most of these costs, and does this proportion change from one education level to another? And when the contribution from the household is high, is it the result of public funding being low or the total cost being high? And what does that mean in terms of, again, the accessibility of these services to all the learners, to all the population? And it poses questions of equity. Should the government be contributing more to the funding of that particular education system so that more families be able to afford accessing those education services? This concludes this third session of Module 2, which was dedicated to costs and financing of education. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to more exchanges with you.